Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. I'm Grant Gross with IDG News Service. I will put the mic up here to amplify myself. We're going to start out with Robert Atkinson, one of the co-authors of the report, How Tech Populism is Undermining Innovation. He's going to talk for a little bit. Robert is president of ITIF, one of the country's foremost thinkers on innovation economics. He has an extensive background in technology policy, and the author of Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage and the Past and Future of America's Economy, Long Waves of Innovation that Power Cycles of Growth. He was vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute and director of PPI's Technology and New Economy Project. So Rob's going to talk about this report.
Okay. Well, thank you, Grant, for moderating this panel, and thank you all for attending. So, somebody asked me a question today, why are you doing this report? Is this just sour grapes because you guys got the wrong end of the stick when it came to the net neutrality Title II decision? And I wish it was that, because it would mean that we could write reports really, really fast. Unfortunately, we've been ideating this for over a year and working on it for at least 6 months. So I want to thank my co-authors, Daniel Castro and Alan McQuinn. So what's going on here? What's going on here is we're talking about how we're all getting old and going to have to be forced retirement soon. But I have to say, when I came to Washington in the early 90s or late 80s, and I worked for the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, that was sort of how tech policy worked back then. You get together a bunch of people who generally knew something, and they would have discussions and dialogues and debates, and then they would come up with an idea and a proposal, and it was very much wonky, very much inside Washington, sort of like a small little group of technocrats. And you can say what you want about it, but one of the things that it had going for it is that it was tried to be based upon facts and analysis. This is largely now what tech policy looks like. You go over to Tom Wheeler's Georgetown house and you have a debate with him. Or you block him from going to work. So what's happened here? Well, first of all, this isn't new. This is a great poster I love, which I had in my first book. This is a poster from the Populist Party, sort of a political poster they would put on, telephone poles or whatever, or sides of buildings. And it was the populist plank, which was essentially to nationalize the railroads, nationalize the telegraph, nationalize the telephone. And the idea was that you couldn't trust these big private, greedy, for-profit corporations, and we need to put everything in the hands of government. But while that sort of had its kind of rise and then went away, and really for a long, long time it sort of was in the background. And in the last, say, 5 years, what's happened is this really amazing rise of what you could call tech populism. And it's you can see it on net neutrality. If you look over there, you can see it on SOPA, on cell phone unblocking, red light cameras, sort of any kind of technology policy issues that might affect the average person has essentially been hijacked into a populist furor. So what is tech populism? Well, it's a debate about important technology policy questions for our country. That's largely marked by fear, misunderstanding, and distrust. So much of what is said in this debate is simply wrong. It's hyperbole at best. It's about demonizing big business if you're on the left, and if you're a tech populist from the right, it's about demonizing big government. And lastly, this is probably perhaps the most controversial assertion we'll make, is it's really fundamentally based in self-interest and selfishness. It's about, why don't I get to download movies without paying? Why don't I get to have a phone that I can buy on the discount and then switch carriers with? Why don't I get to run BitTorrent on my broadband network, even though it screws up everybody else's network, at least under the old version of BitTorrent, not the new one? And I think it's emblematic of, this is essentially, I think James Lincoln Collier, if you haven't read this book, it's one of my favorite books. It's called The Rise of Selfishness in America. And he wrote, "A nation in which people cannot even occasionally put the good of the whole society above their own immediate gratification is bound to grow steadily worse." And I think at the core of tech populism is this sort of rampant self-interest. The self trumps the society. And you'll see that, I think, as we go through this. So what's the alternative? The alternative is not necessarily libertarianism. It's not saying, get rid of policy, get rid of a regulatory framework around these important questions. Rather, we would argue the alternative is essentially just as progressivism in the 19-teens replaced populism as the dominant sort of center-left and left-wing philosophy and guiding principles for our country. We need a tech progressivism to replace populism. The idea there, it would support rules, and just as importantly, it would trust the system to enforce those rules. And I can't tell you the number of times we would argue, for example, with red light cameras, you can put in place rules so that the police don't abuse them and monitor. And the answer we always get is that's what they tell you, but they're going to cheat. They're going to abuse the system. And I think if we're living in a world where you fundamentally just don't trust people, you don't trust the government to enforce rules, you don't trust the private sector to comply with the things that they say or get the government to enforce those rules, then you're just in a whole different world that you can't really have a debate on. Third, it embraces innovation. It doesn't say we're so fearful of this that we've got to stop innovation, whether it's innovation in the network, whether it's innovation in how we use these technologies around us. And lastly, it understands the vital role of industry and government. We're not a state socialist communist society where all the means of production are controlled by the state. We're not a libertarian paradise where we all live on oil rigs off the shore with no rules, okay? So it says government and industry have vital roles. Doesn't mean that you turn a blind eye to abuses or potential abuses, but you recognize that that's what we're doing. So that's a little bit of a side. Self-interest, societal benefits, us versus them versus opportunities to work together. Government and business are something to fear versus legitimate partners. How do you think about these arguments? Is it about emotion? Is it about tweets? Or is it about reason? When you think about technology, you think about, first of all, the risks and the downsides, or do you think, first of all, about the benefits and the opportunities? And lastly, do you just trust the legal system to enforce these rules? So as I said here, it's about really all about self-interest, downloading content without paying, using websites without sharing information, et cetera, et cetera. But I would argue that tech progressivism is an attempt to balance the me versus the we, using technology to make intersections better. There's so much evidence on red light cameras, for example, that they save lives. Yeah, they're inconvenient because I've gotten tickets. If you ever drive MacArthur Boulevard, it's do not drive more than 31 miles an hour or you will get a ticket, as I have gotten twice. Pain in the ass. But
and you're riding your bike.
I was going 32 miles on my bike. So, as I said, tech populism demonizes the we. If you're on the right, it's all about big bad government. It's about to take our liberty away. If you're on the left, it's about big corporations, whether it's big broadband, big content, or whatever, who's trying to just make profits at the expense of our freedom and our privacy, and etc. In contrast, the tech populism respects the we. We respect the fact that government is a body that is designed to act on our collective will. It's a democratic society we live in. We may not like all the decisions that are made, but it's the system that we have to collectively make decisions for us and enforce those decisions. Business is the way we produce goods and services and create wealth and innovation. If you don't fundamentally accept that, then you're, as I said, you're much more likely to be a tech populist. So, lastly, tech populism relies on spin. Now, the fact that a comedian, who, granted, is very, very funny, but the fact that people would take him seriously to inform a very, very critical debate for our country and take what he says as somehow related to reality is really a striking indictment of what's happened to the country. Because John Oliver knows nothing about these issues. Now, what he knows about is he knows how to spin them and he knows how to make them funny. I laughed, I thought it was funny, but it has no relationship to the actual reality of the policy. I don't want to hawk our work. There's a lot of other good groups who do that, but I'll put our work. Tech progressivism relies on analysis. If you read that report, you would realize how, or learn how networks actually work and how different traffic has different needs. Okay. So let me just go through a few of the issues that we looked at in the report. Obviously, net neutrality, can't not look at that. So what's the popular solution? You know, the popular solution is make it into a utility, treat all bits alike. And I love this, talking about spin and propaganda. This was a graphic that got widespread currency during the debate. And I emailed the sort of backer of this, and I asked him, I said, do you honestly believe this is true, or are you just intentionally engaging in propaganda? The latter I would have respect for to some extent. The former I wouldn't. He never responded to me. But if you think about what this is just so far-fetched that it's not even in the realm of reality. And the idea would be that your ISP, if you wanted to go to YouTube, they would block YouTube or Hulu or Yahoo or anything else. They would block those sites unless you paid them a premium. It is beyond belief. Never ever happened, never will happen. Don't need a law to keep that from happening. And yet that was what was put out there in the debate. And I don't blame a lot of people for looking at that and going, wow, that's scary. I don't really like that. Because people aren't experts. They don't study the issue. They don't know about it. They see this and then they believe it. What I blame are the people who put this out there because they know that that is false. They know that they're engaging in propaganda. Now, what's the progressive solution? The progressive solution would be, essentially, if you want to think about that, the popular solution is what Wheeler just did. The progressive solution is what Wheeler proposed last May. Okay? Wheeler's progressive solution was his initial proposal on regulating net neutrality. That was the proposal that we fully endorsed, publicly endorsed. That was a great, great proposal. He switched over from being Chairman Wheeler switched from being a tech progressive to being a tech populist, and as a result, the policy went off the rails. Okay. Online advertising. So the U.S. leads the world in internet ecosystem. We're so far ahead of Europe. I was just over in Brussels, and one of the things that they're really struggling with is why don't we have YouTube? Why don't we have Facebook? Why don't we have Twitter? Why don't we have all these great things that you guys have? And the answer is pretty simple, or one answer is pretty simple. We actually let companies make money on the internet by monetizing ads. In Europe, it's much harder to do that because of their onerous privacy rules. And there's a very good study that Catherine Tucker at MIT has done that empirically shows this point. What would the populist solution be? The populist solution would be essentially to make us into Europe. Prevent companies from using information to have targeted ads, even when those ads are not collecting PII. So what's the progressive solution? The progressive solution is saying you can use that information, but there are a set of rules around how you can use them and what you can do with them and how you cannot share it with other parties. Digital copyright. Again, this was sort of, if you have to sort of say, what was the sort of first major tech populist fiasco or victory? And it was SOPA. And it was really the one that got them all ginned up and all excited and thinking that they could do a lot, which so far has proven correct. But what was the popular solution? The popular solution essentially was we simply should not have any rules regarding the ability of individuals to get illegal digital content. Because any rules will impinge upon our freedom and hurt the internet ecosystem. Okay, so what would the progressive solution be? The progressive solution is that, yes, you know what? DMCA got it right to some extent, to a large extent. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the 90s basically said if you're an intermediary, we're going to have much less liability for you if you take sort of reasonable steps to make sure there's not infringing content on your site. So we're not going to We're not going to throw you in court and give you big fines if accidentally there's infringing content, but if you systematically don't take down infringing content, then that's a problem. That was the right balance. Now, there's a lot of other copyright issues today that are coming up, but what we need to find is the balance on those two sides, not this popular solution that just says, hey, go for it, download anything you want. One that you may not have heard about as much, but is a really, I think, important issue as we move in towards a world where we have essentially IT-enabled cars. Transportation that's essentially all based on IP protocols. So that's going to play itself out in a lot of different ways. Vehicle miles travel tax instead of gas tax. Usage-based car insurance. By the way, really, really important issue. If you could do usage-based car insurance, actually people drive less and they drive more safely. And then connected cars, cars that can talk to one another, avoid accidents. You'd say, well, geez, how can this be controversial? Well, actually, many, many tech populists want to outright ban these things. Say, oh, this is a threat to our privacy. And yet, in all of these cases, you can have the benefits of the privacy while baking, the benefits of the technology while baking in the privacy. Similar issue with drones. Drones are going to be a very important technology going forward. We can't even imagine how drones are going to benefit it yet. And yet, right now, drone innovation is happening faster overseas because of the regulatory frameworks that other governments are putting in place. And part of the regulatory problem here are tech populists who oppose drones because of privacy rules. This is one that I find perhaps the most troubling of all. And that is that in the last 4 or 5 years, the elite opinion in this country has now switched over to accepting the mythology that robots and automation and digital technologies kill jobs. And I say mythology because it is a pure myth. All the economic evidence, every single econometric study, history, and logic all suggest that is not true. And yet, people like Paul Krugman write about it. It's now become part of the myth, and it's been pushed largely initially by tech populists who want to protect an individual worker, but at the expense of the rest of us. Traffic cameras I've talked about, widespread sort of left and right opposition to traffic cameras. I don't want to get a ticket. That's the logic. I don't want to get a ticket, even though the evidence on red light cameras is unequivocal. The insurance institutes and other bodies have shown red light cameras save lives. So what we're talking about here is a choice between saving a significant number of lives every year versus a couple of 100,000 people a year having to pay $50. That's what debate has devolved into. Cell phone unblocking. Again, this was sort of one of those things that one person sort of made this, a tech populist made this a campaign, and they were able to, how dare these companies block you from being able to unlock your phone? Isn't that your right? Isn't that your freedom? Well, they're giving you a phone at a discount. The reason they're giving it as a discount is you're paying monthly for the rest of the phone. If you can not have to do that, if you can just go switch carriers right away, you can get a cheap phone without having to pay the full price. Okay, so where are we headed? One of the things I think about tech populism is it's always looking for the next thing, the next wave, the next big thing. They're not going to say, well, we won on net neutrality, let's all go home and watch our pirated movies. They're going to go and look at new issues, and this is a good example of that. Demand progress, as opposed to hope for progress or wish there was progress. No, we're going to demand progress. And the demand progress was a blimp. They love blimps, too. A blimp at a town hall that Senator Ron Wyden was doing in Oregon, saying, don't betray us. It's another part of the language. If you don't agree with us, you've betrayed us. And this is against the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a trade agreement. Now again, you can have legitimate points of discussion on TPP. We support TPP. But talking about this as if it's betrayal. So there's, as I said, this is going to expand to more and more issues as we go on. So how do we get back on track? Can we get back on track? Well, I think first step is exposing tech populist demagoguery when we see it. And let me be very, very clear. We're not objecting to more and more people getting involved in these debates. That's a very healthy thing. More people should be involved in tech policy debates. I would expect, though, that if someone's going to get involved in a debate, they ought to take a few minutes to actually study the issue before firing off the FCC, auto reply, save the internet. So, and at the same time, there are very good arguments that I've read, for example, on why we should do Title II. I don't agree with them, but they're good arguments. They're good arguments about why SOPA was a bad idea. So I'm not saying that there aren't good arguments on either side of these issues, but there are also a set of arguments that are demagoguery, that are almost outright lies. And that's the part that I think it's collectively our responsibility for when those happen to point those out. And for the media to not take them seriously and not give them currency. Secondly, I think politicians, elected officials, overestimate tech populist political power. So yes, you get a couple of hundred ginned up emails on an issue. There seems to be no evidence that this translates into electoral power. If you look at Lamar Smith, for example, he was targeted after SOPA vote. Last I looked, he didn't lose that election. So there's a lot of smoke, but very little fire here. Again, for elected officials, administration officials, they should be leading the charge towards innovation. They shouldn't be bowing to the pressures of digital mobs and trying to get ahead of the mobs. They should be leaders. They should say, wait a minute, this is demagoguery. This is not the right solution. And we haven't seen enough of that. Lastly, again, as I said very clearly, we need a progressive approach. This is not about a choice between tech populism and libertarianism. There's a middle ground here that says, yes, there are legitimate concerns here. Let's figure out a way to do it that doesn't squash innovation. And lastly, I really, really would hope that the tech populists would use their networks, their emotion, their energy, for doing some things that we really do need. I wish that had been the Tom Wheeler protest. Close the digital divide. You want to know why we lag in broadband adoption in this country? It has nothing to do with the networks, has nothing to do with the price of the networks, has nothing to do with the deployment of the networks. It has to do with the fact that among developed countries, we have the lowest rate of computer ownership by far, by far. We have so many people in the U.S. who cannot afford a computer and broadband, or don't have it. They don't have the digital skills for it. And so we're having this sort of essentially yuppie elite debate about net neutrality when we're ignoring a much more progressive issue and need, which is how do we close the digital divide? I don't see tech populists fighting on the digital divide. And the last point I'll make on this is there's a compromise that is sitting there for the asking right now in Congress, and the window is not going to be open on this for very much longer. And that compromise is essentially to support essentially the kind of bill that Greg Walden has proposed by the Republicans, but have the Democrats, and whether it's the Black Caucus or the Progressive Caucus or the New Dems, to demand that they will sign on to that bill with the requirement that there's a real digital divide component to that. That would do a lot. You would have a framework around net neutrality, and you would also advance the digital divide. There is no tech populist group out there that will take that deal, because it's all about symbolism. It's not about, end of the day, helping people who really do need the help. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
I'll steal the microphone back here. Let me introduce the panelists before we get started on some questions and some comments on Rob's report. Going right to left here, I guess, next to Rob is Larry Irving, President and CEO of the Irving Information Group, consulting firm that serves telecom and IT companies, foundations, and nonprofits. He was formerly head of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and was principal architect of President Clinton's telecommunications, internet, e-commerce initiatives, and acted as a senior advisor to President Clinton, Vice President Gore, and the Secretary of Commerce. He served on the Clinton-Gore transition team, and with Bruce coming later, he co-founded the Internet Innovation Alliance, a broadband advocacy group. Next to Larry is Elliot Maxwell, chairman of E. Maxwell & Associates. He advises public and private sector clients on strategic issues involving intersection of business, technology, and public policy in internet and e-commerce domains. He is a member of the National Research Council's Board on Research, Data, and Information, a fellow of the International University of Japan, a trustee emeritus of Brown University, and a member of the Board of Trustees of Selve Regina University. He worked closely with the Committee for Economic Development on a series of reports on the digital economy, and with MIT and EPC Global GS1 on policy issues surrounding the implementation of the electronic product code version of RFID. I'm doing shortened bios here because all of these guys have done a lot of stuff and have impressive resumes. Bruce Mehlman on the far left, at least on this panel.
Yes, you say that. Not in life.
Is a founding partner of the bipartisan firm Mehlman. Is it
Castagnetti?
There you go. Rosen, Engel, and Thomas, and is widely regarded as an expert in running issue campaigns, managing C-suite associations, and developing strategies to achieve policy outcomes. He serves as the executive director of the Technology CEO Council and co-chairman of the Internet Innovation Alliance. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for technology policy in the George W. Bush administration. Yes. So let me start by asking a question and asking the rest of the panelists to kind of respond to what Rob said in the last few minutes here. My first kind of thought when I read the report and heard about the report is democracy is messy. That people get involved, and sometimes people don't always know what they're talking about when they get involved in issues. I get people hitting me on Twitter every day on stories I write. So we had this old way of doing tech policy that involved a smaller group of people who were admittedly experts, but now we have more people involved. Is that always preferable? It seems that one alternative to tech populism is tech progressivism, but another alternative is kind of tech elitism, maybe, or tech lobbyism, if that's a word. So go ahead. Who wants to start? Bruce, you want to start?
Okay then. Just appreciate ITIF having all of us here. It's always humbling and fun to be with Elliot and Larry, let alone to get an early look at some of the stuff ITIF does. I thought it was a very interesting report. There's a lot I agree with. It was funny in two regards, a little populist in its, well, the populists are the bad, ignorant people, and the progressives are the good, smart, thoughtful people. But of course, I respect and admire that. The other piece that actually had me laugh out loud when reading the report is the line, the first step is for policymakers in both legislative and executive bodies to be vigilant for signs of demagoguery. The idea that we're asking lawmakers to be vigilant for signs of demagoguery is, truly the fox is guarding the hen house. I believe in 22 years I've observed a little bit, but my three broad thoughts were, first, I think you're on to more of a macro trend than a tech-specific trend. And so if you take a look at a country divided very much between red states and blue states, partisan divisions, slowing congressional progress down, concern about a wave of immigration, concern about big banks, concern about the uber rich getting involved in politics, concerned about income inequality. You've just defined the 1880s perfectly. You've also defined the current time. Interestingly, and not surprisingly, the 1880s led to the Williams Jennings Bryan populism and to the Teddy Roosevelt progressivism. History does repeat itself often. And by the way, there was, in the late 1880s, there was a rising flow of new technology, too. Ultimately, in the car, the airplane, pretty profound changes. An interesting thing, I think, on this great report to subsequently do is let's go back and take a look and learn what were the lessons, because in the end, a lot of the problems were addressed by prudent public policy. A lot of the worst populist instincts were snuffed out. But it is a macro trend, and so things that weren't in the report, where I find a greater populist rhetoric, our trade, crony capitalism like Exim Bank, some of the tax reform, internet governance, the surveillance conversation that Elliot was on before it was even cool. I think we need to not lose sight of it's the bigger populism, progressivism debate that's afoot. It's not a tech-specific thing. Number two observation was that tech tools by your funders, by the members of ITIC and others, are the new populist WMD, the weapons of mass demagoguery. Never have more people had more power to have more influence than ever before, thanks to Twitter and Facebook and all of these awesome technologies. When it's good, it's the Arab Spring, it's the destruction of FARC in Colombia, it's really positive, exciting things. When it's bad, it's John Oliver setting public policy. And then three, I would observe, the other thought I had when reading the report is let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I'd love to say it's all this kind of digital rabble, but if you want to really look back on the net neutrality, and I am very much against the Title II, I think calling broadband a regulated utility is the worst of policy conclusions. And if you want to know where it came from, it's the enlightened digitarati or technorati, Google, Netflix, the president. I mean, a lot of folks who were driving the result, not necessarily at the very end. Google, to their credit, pulled back substantially. Netflix may or may not have gotten the outcome they actually wanted. It depends if you believe their CFO in unguarded comments or their Washington spin when speaking to the policy folks. But we regularly are our own enemies on this. I would also dispute on SOPA. I mean, I guess I remember it a little bit differently because I would otherwise be part of the populists, and heaven forfend I would be a tech populist. But my recollection is that you've had, since the advent of the internet, which for all of its great things is a platform that makes it easier to take digitized content that should be protected and have it less protected, and you've had this Silicon Valley Hollywood debate over how do we protect content, with Hollywood understandably with their hair on fire continuing to try to shift liability to the tech industry. And you had a lot of folks like CEA, hardly radicals, and a lot of real industry folks saying, hey, this proposed legislation shifts liability too far, and it makes folks who host communities policemen for the speech on the communities, and that's not right. And that, as I recall, was when the debate got a little bit hot. If we want to, we can go back and relitigate 2011 and whether or not it was overhyped. It certainly was overhyped. At the same time, just because it was overhyped doesn't mean the underlying threat wasn't bad policy.
Elliot. Well, I'll start with a disclaimer. I guess that I thought the report was very interesting, very, sort of well written. I would accept the premise that we need better data, we need better analytics. We shouldn't have as much hyperbole. We should be able to sort out hyperbole from fact. We should aim for growth. We should aim for innovation. People should tell the whole truth as opposed to parts of the truth. That we should have more respect in terms of the kind of interchanges we have. But I don't recall a kind of digital Eden 20 years ago or 30 years ago in which I participated. There were very smart people. It was a smaller group. There was less evidence, less data, because in fact data wasn't shared and data wasn't available. And I think maybe I'm asking Rob to do a different paper than he did and his co-authors. And that paper would be something titled like how the crapification of data, the self-interest of parties, the crippling of independent analytic capabilities have in fact harmed our ability to make good policy. That's the paper I would have written, because this paper, as I see it, looked at one side of the debate and caricatured it, and ignored the other side of most technological policy debates and the kind of flaws on both sides of these debates that make it harder and harder to do good policy. So I'll talk maybe about one little experience that I had that suggests the other side of this issue. And that was the debate over NIH's policy to provide open access to research that they funded after an embargo of a year, or others proposed 6 months, and the fight about that with the scientific publishing community. So I did a little piece about that issue, trying to find out what the facts were, what the evidence was. And the debate was really, in terms of kind of simplifying it, NIH spends about $30 billion a year to support biomedical research. That generates about 90,000 articles a year. And the issue was whether NIH-funded research would be available to the public after 12 months passed for free, posted on a website at NIH. Scientific publishers hated this idea. And they said a whole range of things which, in terms of hyperbole, is matched only by some of the things that Rob quoted in his piece. There wasn't going to be any scientific research because all of the outlets for research are going to go out of business. There was going to be no check on the quality of research, so crappy research was going to emerge, and no one would know the truth. All of the journals would go out of business. I'm literally saying what people said at the time. And what I tried to do was to go through every single submission by the scientific publishers, every piece of public testimony, every piece of evidence that was presented. And the fact is, there was absolutely no data from the people who had the data, which were the scientific publishers, about the effect of this policy. Absolutely no data. Now, at the other side, what was interesting, and we saw this in telecom as well, was the scientific publishers were going to Wall Street and saying, the future is rosy. We've got a great business. We've got wonderful margins. We're expanding. And just invest in us because we are the future. Now, this lesson for me was that A, we needed data, we want data, sometimes we don't have data, but we should have the ability to get it, and that people's self-interest, whether it is what I would think of as the caricature of everybody wanting to be able to download pirated movies, or everyone wanting to protect their margins, corrupts the policy process. And we've got to do better. And in Rob's case, I know he spent his lifetime trying to provide better policy. So I have no quarrel at all with Rob's experience and his interpretation of that. But I see it as a failure on both sides. And I'm happy to have the rise of groups like Public Knowledge, who try to represent a view that is consistent with my own view about the values of sharing, the values of openness, and the importance of participation by informed groups of people who take the other side from people whose self-interest is in their business model and not necessarily the larger society. Because I would argue that not only are there people individually who are selfish, but that firms who have their own profit goals and their own business models can be simply just as selfish and just as sparing with the truth. So if I were writing the paper, it would be about both sides. And it would be recognizing that the importance of openness of information, the importance of openness of process, and the responsibility of policymakers to actually dig in and make their own independent decisions is what's critical for better policy, not to demonize one or avoid or sugarcoat the failings on both sides of many of these issues, where information is withheld, where the whole truth isn't given, and where their interests trump what should be the societal benefits. And it's up to the people who are making policy to focus on those societal benefits, sort through the data, find better ways of getting access to data, make their decisions, and move forward. So my paper is a different paper than Rob's. My paper, I think, speaks more generally to one of the issues that Bruce raised about this kind of meta trend, and would look for greater independent capabilities within the government to gather data, to analyze the data, more participation by people who, in fact, analyze the data independently, and the courage to be able to make better decisions. If, in fact, we were besieged by digital mobs, then I think the world would be a quite different place than it is now. And if you ask the people who generally support the ideas of public knowledge and the like, I don't think they see themselves as riding this enormous current that will sweep before them all policy decisions, nor should it. But both sides bear a responsibility to make this policy better, and we all would be better off if that happened. All right, Larry.
So let me start by commending Rob and his colleagues for the report and thanking ITIF for inviting me. And let me start also by saying that any comments I make reflect only my views, not any organization with which I'm associated or any organization which will never associate with me after my comments. It's interesting because there's a lot of, I agree with a lot of what both Bruce and Elliot said in terms of this is a macro problem. Washington seems to be devoid of adults. I had the pleasure, the honor maybe, of working on telecom policy and technology policy when the internet had 2 million people worldwide, and we're helping to craft a framework. Like Dr. Nelson's here, people like Tom Close in the White House, Ron Brown. There were a lot of folks, and we were trying to figure out what the right goals were. And it's not as if the open internet is some kind of new and novel idea. And it's not as if we weren't talking about inclusiveness and trying to bring people onto the net in terms of digital divide in the 90s. And yet somehow this generation of thinkers and policymakers think they're the first folks to ever actually conceive of the concept of an open internet. The first time the words internet and open were written in a paragraph, either I or somebody on my team at NTI wrote them in 1993. So this isn't anything new. We've always believed in the open internet, and there's no dispute about an open internet. The points that were made by Elliot and Bruce about the demagoguery is on the right. You had folks who were saying we can never have any rules at all with regard to the internet, even if it's an open internet. You had folks, unless it has to be an absolutely open internet. Well, that gets you nowhere. Fortunately, most people who had policy jobs realized that would get us nowhere. And we tried to be inclusive. And now, I have to take a little bit of, I had a little bit of a problem with the very first slide that Rob put up. And the reason I had a problem with it, you had 5 white guys and a white girl. And they were making policy for the world and internet policy. Well, that's kind of a problem we're still seeing, because it's not just techno-populism, it's techno-elitism. There's a reason that I have this, the comment that Rob made at the very end, I've been making for 12 months, I was the only one making it. I went up to Silicon Harlem to talk about the problem with net neutrality and the fact that in Harlem we have people who don't have internet, and yet people, progressives on the left, somehow think that a problem that doesn't really exist, they can't get access to stuff on the net, no one's ever actually been denied it, is a huge problem that requires that they stand in front and tame themselves to hide from the FCC. And you try to talk about the digital divide, we'll get to that. Well, black folks and brown folks and poor folks are here, we'll get to that most of our lives. And this inability from folks on the left, most of whom represent organizations that have almost no black people and almost no brown people and almost no Ivy League people and no people who actually understand the problem of not having technology, the fact that they would assume that they're only progressives, the only populists in the country, that's not just offensive, that's degrading. And then when you have policymakers who pander to that community, and the problem isn't populism, it's pandering to populism, which is the problem that I have. Let's talk about what the real issues are in our country. And let's have a conversation where the adults step up, and instead of amplifying ridiculous remarks on either the left or the right, say, what are the problems that we have and what are the solutions? What's good about this report is it gets us to start thinking about issues. But there's a degree of truth in what Elliot said, that it does feed a bit on left. I can give you some similar atrocities of intellectual obfuscation on the right, if I had time. I couldn't figure out. I was trying to keep it a little bit.
That's better than weapons of mass destruction.
Not really. But the point I think we have to keep making is, when you're talking about progressives, when you're talking about populism, when you're talking about technology policy, we've never seen a wealth creation machine as important as the internet, and this is incredibly important because there is a huge amount of wealth and capital being created because of the internet. But as important, we've never seen an information processing machine as important as the internet. And how do we get it to everybody? And when you have companies that and organizations that don't seem to care about full deployment, don't seem to care about full employment, don't seem to care about who sits on boards, don't seem to care about how is this going to truly be a revolution that benefits every American, you got a problem. And it's a bigger problem. The adult at the table in every international discussion that I've ever been on internet and telecommunications policy has always been America, the United States of America. From 1993 to 1995 to 1996 with Belgium or with Brussels or Berlin or Tokyo or Johannesburg, South Africa. We've been the voice of reason. We've been the ones that have said, hey, look, we can't tilt to the right or to the left. We've got to have an internet policy that is not directed by government, that is not run by the demagogues, but that is an open system, that we try to get universal service, that we try to be pragmatic. When the United States government starts going backwards in time and regulating the most important intellectual, informational, and economic innovation of the last century, as if it's a 18th, 19th century utility, because of demagogic voice on the left, or voices on the left or the right, that's a problem. How do we now say to Iran or China or ITU or anybody else who wants to regulate this in a way that's counterintuitive to progress, if we can't have an adult conversation in our nation? If you're acting like a child screaming when you're in the United States, you can't become an adult when you go over to an international forum. And the unfortunate reality is, when you listen to the statements on both sides of this debate, they're not adult statements. They're not people saying, what's the problem? How do we get there? You're worried about not enough innovation? Okay, we're going to try to make sure that we don't disrupt innovation and investment. You're worried about somebody intruding on your ability to get content? We're going to make sure we have rules that are enforceable that allow you. But we're not going to swing back to, pre-Teddy Roosevelt to do that. I wish I could get some passion about this issue, and if I do, I'll come back.
Let me give Rob a chance to comment just briefly on
the assault.
on what's been said the last couple of minutes.
All right, well, thank you to all three of you. So let me just quick comment. Absolutely agree with Bruce, but our name is the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, so don't really think about in a serious way all those other things, because it's not our space. So I agree with you that there's a broader rise of populism, but our space to talk about is in tech, and so that's why we talk about it. But I think a very important point you raised. We could see a national election, I pray to God we don't, where you have a populist from both parties running a very heavy populist campaign, and that would be a disaster in my view. With regard to the point, Bruce, you talked about with SOPA, and it was a Silicon Valley Hollywood debate, I wish it was a Silicon Valley Hollywood debate, and it wasn't. I think if what happened in that debate, I'm happy to go and do a blow-by-blow history, was that debate, sort of that inside the beltway, sit down, hash it out, negotiate it, that got totally sidetracked by the populists. And at that point, the tech community knew they were going to win without having to negotiate and compromise, and it was all over after that. I think, and I still believed if we'd had the adults in the tech world sit down with the adults in the content world, we would have hammered out a really, really good bill that would have satisfied everybody. And just to be clear, we did not agree with the final SOPA bill. We were on record. I'd go back. I'm happy to share. We're on record saying that bill went too far, and here were the reasons it went too far. But we were supportive of the entire concept. And that's why I believe that we could have hammered out a rational policy that would have really dealt with a major deal, a major challenge, which is we lead the world in content. And yet, piracy is a huge threat to our ability to lead that world and have jobs. So I wish it had been an inside the Beltway debate, and I think we could have gotten there. Elliot, to your point, geez, after having been a project director at OTA, Office of Technologies, what do you want me to say? Absolutely, totally agree. I think it was a disaster when Congress demolished OTA, although technically OTA still exists, it just has no money. So, in theory, we could all go work. You could go work there.
I could work for free.
We could all go and work for free. It's there. But no, I absolutely agree. But it's not just the loss in Congress. There's been a diminution of analytical capabilities in the federal government. Sort of policy shops that have gotten a lot smaller because of budget pressures and anti-government pressures from the right. So I think we would be in a much better world if the government itself had stronger analytical capabilities. So don't disagree with that. Your point about publishers, here's where I think I do disagree with you a little bit, is I find it troubling that you have groups in this space who are totally on one side or the other. We totally agree with you on the publisher thing, Ellie. Totally agree with you. I think that's a wise policy. We've talked about that before. I don't agree on the piracy part. And yet you go to an EFF or a PK, they only have one position on everything. It's all one thing. There's no differentiation. There's no discernment here. And so, your point about sort of the publisher spinning this and all, absolutely. Lobbyists do that. I don't disagree with that. And yet, I think the difference between what lobbyists do, lobbyists will say that's why they're paid. What their job is. Their job is to advance their case in the most effective way. It's our job as independent groups or as policymakers and it's your job to understand it and analyze it and point out why it's wrong if it's wrong. What I think the difference is, though, with populists, tech populists, and I would put PK in this category for some of what they do. Some of what they do I think is quite legitimate and advances the debate. But some of what they do, and I put EFF much more on this side. So if you sort of take, what's your share of progressivism versus populism ratio? I think the EFF share is lower, higher populism, less progressivism. PK is a little better. They don't oftentimes fight on and make an attempt to even have some level of sort of rational argumentation. You look at the EFF website in particular, very little argumentation there. It's all about campaigns. It's all about demonization. And while lobbyists, you cannot agree with them, they don't engage in that sort of debate, and that's why I was talking about that. They don't demonize. They can spin, very different than demonizing. On this left-right thing, Larry, so I think there's sort of two parts to this. There's a left-right thing, and then there's a sort of public versus insider. It's really sort of like a four-cell matrix, maybe. And on the left-right, we talk about some of the right-wing populists in here, and totally agree that there are right-wing populists, and they're a big problem. However, I will say this, though. I know this sounds self-serving. I've been doing these debates for 25 years. I have never, ever been called, my personal integrity has never been questioned by a Republican or a conservative. They've called me stupid. They've called me ill-advised. They tell me I don't know what I'm talking about.
Just sorry about that.
I know, Bruce.
What are you talking about? I apologize.
That was at lunch.
You're talking about politeness as opposed to policy.
I think politeness and civility have a, so when they call me, when they say that I'm stupid, they do it in a polite way. They say, Rob, we really like what you're doing, but boy, you're totally off base here. You didn't really study this one. Fine, legitimate argument. On a regular basis, the left will not tell me I'm stupid, they'll tell me I'm craven. That's pretty much the left. That is the de facto tech populist argument against any argument we say. You're in the pocket of X, therefore we can dismiss all of your argument. Look, to me that's sort of the hobgoblin of a weak mind. You don't have any attempt to study what we're saying, and which you did, and you responded You didn't say, "Oh, Rob, you pointed out where you disagreed with me," and I think that's one of the differences here. So yeah, sure. And just to close, look, absolutely on all fronts, everybody in the debate has a responsibility to become more adult, become less inflammatory, be more respectful, to be more data focused. I agree with all of that. And yet, the reason we focused on tech populism and tech populists is I see them as not like an outlier, like not doing. They're the farthest pushing in the wrong direction, in my view. And they're the ones who are doing the most to destroy rational analysis in Washington, which is why we called them out.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes and no. The good thing about being old is you've seen it all before. And I was there in the Fairness Doctrine back in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of the heated rhetoric you see on the left today, you saw on the right then. And I'm a lefty. I've worked for lefties. I'm a proud lefty. And you do get tired when you've had the same position, or you've modified your position over 20 years, and people come up to you and say, "Well, you're just a running dog for XYZ company." And so, well, read the stuff I wrote in 1993. See how we went from 2 million to 3.5 billion people on the internet. See how we've kind of led the world in innovation, job creation, economic growth, and precisely why should we change those policies today? And you kind of get, well, that may all be right, but you're still a running dog for whatever. And it does get old, and I get to the right day. A very senior official who'd been a lobbyist for many years of his life came up the other day, and because I was against Title II, and said, "I guess you have to make a living too." Oh. I'm like, dude, I mean, like, one, I don't lobby, and two, I have been consistent with the feeling that you generally get better economic outputs if you give people some regulatory certainty. We're headed into an era of regulatory uncertainty amplified, so let's see if we can find some kind of a moderation of the policies that help us internationally and will continue to drive growth. And somehow that makes me craven. That's my issue. I sleep well at night, and I don't feel like I've changed my policies. We do have to stop with the politics of personal destruction, both at the macro and the micro level. But it is important. It is important that we have a more inclusive debate. And the debates have got to be about more than just what a group of people, millennials, Gen Xers, and what you worry about is that these aren't political decisions. When I was in the Commerce Department, the thing we always wanted to ensure we didn't do was let budget drive policy. That we didn't want to make spectrum policy or telecom policy just for the purposes of hitting the federal budget. And what I'm more worried about is we're letting politics drive policy. And that's as dangerous if all we're looking at is what 4 or 5 million millennials who went to Ivy League schools and who have a particular perspective want to do with the internet, and we're not worried about what does that mean for brown communities and black communities and working class communities. It is instructive to me that that the policies that I think make sense are the same policies that the NAACP and the National Urban League and MALDA and unions. And I had 4 unions in my family, including 2 members of my family who were CWA workers. And CWA was in favor of something less than Title II, even though CWA is a union that grew up under Title II. That's instructive to me. And where were those voices in this debate? Were they listened to? Were they responded to? Is there one comment where, how do we do this? Because if you live in Georgetown or live in McLean or live in Fairfax, and what I believe will happen with regard to some of the things we're doing, if we see less investment in the infrastructure, if we see less innovation, if we see job creation stilted, the people who are going to be hurt by that aren't the people in Fairfax and in Georgetown and in McLean. They're the people in Brownsville, Texas, or Brooklyn. Well, not Brooklyn anymore, because now it's all yuppified. But it's the people in Bed-Stuy who still got some brothers and sisters. I mean, the folks who are going to get hurt are disproportionately black. They're disproportionately brown. They're disproportionately workers. And where's that conversation? How are they included? Let's say you're wrong. Let's say we don't see the same level of CapEx. Who do the people get hurt? If we don't see innovation, we don't see deployment. Hell, we've got all kinds of folks jumping up and down about an unnamed company that's huge that's deploying fiber. And every place they deploy fiber, none of the people there look like me. And they're redlining, and nobody seems to give a damn on my side of the aisle, on my side of the political equation, notwithstanding the fact that folks who look like me give Democrats 80 to 90% of their vote. Where's the outrage about that? That's a real problem. No one seems to care. And so I don't mean to be too passionate, but I mean, but it gets to me that when Rob talks about people calling him craven and a running dog, and there are folks who are like pushing the political agenda of companies that don't hire minorities, don't deploy minority communities, and don't seem to care about average workers, how's that a good thing? Just doesn't make sense.
Let me ask another question or two, but if audience members have questions, be thinking about those. We've got about a half an hour left here, so hopefully we'll have time for audience questions. Rob talked in his presentation and report too about basing tech policy on rational thought and policy proposals based on facts and logic, and I think it's hard to argue with doing that, right? In my position as a tech policy reporter, I get pitched a lot of studies and economic policy analysis based on tech issues. And not to implicate anybody in this room, but I find a lot of that not very good. For one thing, it's all sponsored by somebody, and whether it's an advocacy group or a trade group or a think tank who takes money from other places. And when I see who sponsors that study, without even opening the study, I can figure where they're going with that study. 99% of the time, or the author. So either there's some intellectual dishonesty there where they're not kind of looking at a broader range of issues, or they're looking at a broader range of issues and they don't make them into the study that comes out. And either one of those is a bit of a problem. And so, and the other thing I see with a lot of studies is, while it's easy to look back at a policy and say, here's what happened after we instituted this policy and here was the economic consequences of the policy, I see a lot of people trying to predict what happens if a policy is enacted, and that seems to be a bit of a more slippery slope in terms of what factors you factor in and what factors you factor out, and how broadly you're looking at the landscape. So, any thoughts on any of that?
I spent a batch of time in looking at the biomedical area, particularly about publishing and the like. But one of the things that's interesting about the field is that there's been work done on trying to compare sponsored research with unsponsored research. And this is particularly with respect to the efficacy of drugs. So you'd like to know whether the research on that differs if it's sponsored by the proposing company or by independent academics. And the answer is, there have been some analyses of these things, that it differs dramatically.
I'm not surprised.
So the empirical work, at least in that area, suggests that there should be a reasonable level of skepticism applied to sponsored research. Doesn't mean that it can't be good, because it can be, but that it should be looked at skeptically. The second part of your question, or something that you implied in the question, was, do we look back at what happens after a policy is made? Do we actually understand what the impacts are? And there's very, very little work done in that area. And it's really distressing, because that's the way you learn. And we don't have enough people looking at what the policy was, what it was like before, what it's like after, what the results are, so that we can get better at it. And it's another piece of this lack of analytic capability and lack of respect for data and information that marks the policy process, and it makes it, and it's less likely that it happens as budgets get slimmer and slimmer. But it's one of the things that we really would benefit from.
Go ahead.
Two very quick points. One, I hope we get to a point where we can find folks, philanthropies, foundations, some independent somebody who will support unsponsored research. The problem is it's very hard to find funding.
Right.
And I'll say that from someone who's worked on sponsored research, that has supported sponsored research, and someone who's also worked on unsponsored or objective with no corporate or interest group sponsor. It is important that we find a way to get that, and that money doesn't exist in any large. One of those interesting things I found running around the planet is a publication called The Conversation in Australia that will only take reports and only take articles submitted by people who will attest and aver and certify that none of that they're not sponsored by any interest group. They're academics, and it is purely their view. We need more of that in discussions. Whatever side you're on, having objective facts and objective figures and objective analysis can only be helpful. I'm not opposed to sponsored reports. I would like to see more. I don't think you squash those, but I'm a person who, you look at what the cigarette industry has done, you look at the climate deniers, you can see that sometimes the folks who pay for outcomes can be a problem in terms of the national debate. But I also think that having data from anybody is better than having no data.
So, a couple of things. One, we don't do sponsored reports, which I know you weren't saying.
I was not implying that.
No, I know you weren't. But secondly, I think we've got to stop giving academics a pass here. I mean, I really hate to sound like an old guy, but geez, when I got my PhD, there was an ethos, and you get drummed into you every single day when you were getting your PhD, whether you're in research methods or stats or whatever. Your job was to interpret the world and accurately reflect it back. Your job was not to spin. Your job was not to have an opinion. Your job was not to impose your political views on the world through your research. Now, we all understood that we're all humans and that it's really, really hard not to let your biases come through. But there was sort of like almost like a Hippocratic oath among academics back then that you try to be objective. I think that's just vanished. The fact that Susan Crawford could publish her book with the same people who published our book, Yale Press, that was not an academic book. Okay? I mean, let's be honest. There was not an academic book. There were mistakes in that book. There were numbers in that were wrong. And yet, because Susan didn't get money, purportedly, I guess, her work is objective. And I think we have to recognize that there's two sources of problems here. There's the bias problem of ideology, which, by the way, a lot of think tanks, I think when people, particularly on the right, when they accuse them of taking money for, 90% of the time it's that their ideology leads them in that direction. You can disagree with their ideology and all, but it's oftentimes ideology that looks like. So I do think we have to recognize we shouldn't give academics a pass, nor should we give foundations a pass. I mean, again, I go with Larry's point. Sorry, Larry, pile on to this, but now we're in this gripe session, I guess. I find it amazing that foundations, major foundations in the world, who used to be, their mission was ending poverty in Appalachia and Harlem and Africa, are spending enormous amounts of money on these white yuppie issues. I find it amazing.
You'll get look at who works for those foundations.
There you go.
It's the problem.
That may be.
You have a better chance of finding a brother who's a skier than a brother who's running a major foundation. Except for the Ford Foundation.
Or a polo player.
A polo player. Well, that's polo for Brazil. So
okay.
American brothers.
All right.
Any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, just I've got a sitting on the far right as far as the audience is concerned, and being the Republican on the panel, I'm forced to make a market point. When I was a staffer, you go back to the old Moynihan great line, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. Everybody has their own facts. Everybody has an academic. Everybody has about 2 think tanks. We took Rob even disappointingly took a shot at lobbyists, but frankly, lobbyists spin things consistent with their funders, so seemingly do think tanks and academics and everybody else. I kind of go back to Federalist 10. I actually think they figured this out when they wrote the Constitution. They know what people are like, and human nature hasn't changed. What has changed, and where I think this report's huge contribution is, it takes a look at this new populist trend that is macro, but is suddenly on our issues for the first time. That hadn't been true. Coupled with, when on our issues, the people most likely to use the new WMD, the weapons of mass demagoguery, are people who care about our issues. I think, as a staffer when I was on the Hill, I would get the left, I would get the right. It was my job to be a good staffer, my boss's job to be a good member, to make sure I was trying to hear from everybody, because I knew I was going to have separate sets of facts, separate sets of arguments. And if I did my job right, I would try to gather as much as I could. When I would have lobbyists or academics or think tankers in, I'd make them refute the other side's points. And it was my job to try to find the truth amidst academics, lobbyists, think tanks, spin guys, and everybody else's countering facts and countering opinions. And in a perfect world, I would have the time to think, I would have the training to understand, and over time I'd be able to give my boss my best interpretation of what I thought the truth was, which was always going to be somewhere in the 50% I'm right, 40-something% I'm wrong, best guess. That is the world we live in. It's the world we've always lived in. The challenge now is that the speed of information, the speed of politics have picked up so much, combined with, and I think a very fair point, the firepower of analytic capacity available to the Congress and the time in which they're allowed to think have shrunk. So we kind of have the worst of all worlds at the same time. It's my own, both being an optimist and a market guy, it's my own belief that policymakers are going to figure out how to deal with the new volume. A great point in the report is they're going to learn how not to be chased off by the John Oliver inspired, Twitter storm. And I believe in the not distant future, just as there was the progressive ultimate victory over the populists in the late 1880s, I think policymakers are going to be able to get past the currently new and not known how to deal with phenomenon of WMD attacks and excessive facts, insufficient time, and political panic.
Let me say one quick thing, Bruce, because I know your point about you bring people in and have them talk to one another. I think we've really lost that procedural method in Washington. You look at, for example, the FCC workshops. Those are basically workshops where you bring in a bunch of people on different sides, and they just make their 6 minutes, and they do their thing, and then I make my 6 minutes. It's the opposite, and FTC's like that. Congressional hearings are even worse. And what we don't have is sort of somebody whose job is to say, look, I'm going to call you out on that. That what you said doesn't make any sense. Defend that. Or wait a minute, you said this, but he said this, you're different. Tell me why you're right, you're wrong. We don't go down into that next level. It's just sort of, I'm going to do my spin, you do your spin, and then hopefully we learn something. And I think that's a failure of the political and governmental process. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a way for the FCC or the FTC to do that when they do workshops. And I think if they structured workshops, and even if we had sort of some kind of new congressional hearing, where it's not just each side doing their spin so that you get talking points, that, I know that maybe that's naive, but it seems to me that process would help us.
Anybody have any questions from the audience? I have more, but go ahead.
Is there a mic or is it just okay? So yeah, my name is Will Reiner. I'm from the American Action Forum, and actually I did a lot of my graduate studies in communication theory in addition to economics, and was looking at networked spheres and how people actually communicate within these network spheres. And so I was just wondering if the idea, or not really the idea, but the expansion of how people actually get their knowledge now has changed these debates, and how that may kind of opened up the box. And the reason I say this is because, one of the things, obviously we're very interested in policy here, but one of the big things that I think is very interesting is the vaccine debate, which quite literally has actually harmed people. And one of the things that seems to happen with that is that people are constructing their own facts. So in the past, there was much more of a gatekeeper function that existed, say, with public health officials and with doctors. But now that's completely different. The introduction of WebMD obviously changes people's relationships to knowledge. And then, in fact, the internet writ large has changed people's relationship to knowledge and what they perceive as correct or okay knowledge. So I'm just wondering if you talked about that in your paper. I haven't had the time to read this, but how that kind of changes the debate. And I think it really changes the structure of policy generally, but that seems to me to be part of this conversation that is not very often discussed.
Nor in our report. Well, no, it's a really important point, and it's just an area we didn't delve down into enough because it's kind of an area we know about it, but haven't studied it. But again, I go back to Bruce's point. It's kind of one of those double-edged swords. At one level, WebMD, and there's really an article in the Post of the Times today about somebody who had brain cancer, and how they were able to get all of this knowledge, and it really helped. So that's the plus side of that. 10 years ago, you couldn't do that. You couldn't get all that knowledge yourself. So on the downside is you believe, my wife sends me stuff all the time, and I'm like, oh God, don't believe what you just read here because it's completely wrong. So it goes both ways.
I was thinking about working on a paper about the issue of how you sort of make information credible, how to make judgments about the information that's available on the internet. And so I went to a guy who I worked with, who was at IBM at the time, head of research, and he said, "Yeah, you could write a great paper on that. I have 100 people working on it, and we still don't know how to do it." Which is, all that stuff is out there, and it's very, very difficult to figure out whether it's any good. And that's going to be a really, really important problem to be working on, because given the range of information that's available, you need to be able to have some notion of whether it's any good. And we used to be able to say with confidence that you could turn to this place or that place, but those voices in some ways get swamped by the amount of noise. And the vaccine thing is a perfect example of information that's out there that's horrible, information that's out there that's good, people not knowing where to turn to for good information. And that's a really important problem.
You can just take it back to even the net. I mean, the net neutrality debate. If you go to the left groups, it's like corporations are trying to stop you from getting the internet. It's the end of democracy. You go to the right groups, Obamacare for the net or ObamaNet or whatever, and Barack Obama wants to take over the internet so he can push his Kenyan socialist agenda. I mean, and they'll take one or two credible people that you'll respond to, and then they'll take the talking points they use for everything else, and then you got 2.5 million people on the left and 1.5 million people on the right who are ready to go to arms because of completely inaccurate information. And how do it's very hard to stop that. That goes through the Twitterverse and goes through the blogs and goes through Breitbart and goes through Blue State Nation, and the next thing you know, you've got a war over something that if you got 20 people with some sense in a room, you could probably figure out a way that you could get an open internet that that wasn't regulated in a way that would be offensive or problematic for further investment. But everybody's they're all heightened now, and I don't know what you do about that, because I know I'm in enough campaigns where I do think there are real problems where we sometimes use hyperbolic language, and that's the tool you get to get people agitated and active.
Go ahead.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. I think you have a 4 or 5 volume set in the works. Clearly, we need to look at the right wing. We need to look at some of the other issues you haven't touched on. But it seems to me that part of the problem here is a belief in techno-magic. There's this sense that we can have a simple solution to any problem. Lately on the Hill, we've been hearing about how the jihadists are recruiting people over the internet. So let's make the ISPs somehow monitor what the jihadists are doing. We have this sense that technology is supposed to solve all our problems, and the simple solutions that are coming out of the minds of politicians and the mouths of politicians go out there, and people believe them because they believe technology is magic. But the other problem is we don't have economic models, we don't have the economic analysis necessary to figure out whether these simple-minded solutions might work or not. And as a result, you end up with 3 different analyses that say totally contradictory things. So I'm wondering, did you explore this overconfidence in our technological capabilities in your study? And do we have a hope of understanding futures that are changing so fast with proper economic analysis?
So there's a whole bunch of people, Morozov, or he says that now. Also, the guy who said IT doesn't matter,
Nicholas Carr.
Nick Carr. And this is now sort of the popular. I mean, if you read Nick Carr's book, which please don't read it, we over faith in technology. We shouldn't have planes that fly themselves. Well, it seems to me that would have been a pretty good thing if we had a plane that flew itself in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago. So I actually, there are people who go too far, and the sort of the ISIS problem. That's a wicked problem, and the internet's not going to solve it. But there are a lot of problems that are relatively tame problems where technologies will make huge advances, and I think healthcare is one. We are going to have better health care because of data mining. Stoplights, red light cameras. We can really improve our transportation system. I did a little piece for the Milken Institute on the promise of autonomous vehicles. Are autonomous vehicles going to end all accidents and fatalities and injuries? No. But the evidence is pretty clear that they're going to radically reduce them. So I think we're much better off sort of tilting towards technology optimism with a sort of dose of realism, Mike. But
my argument is that the optimism is actually feeding the simple-minded solutions. People are proposing the simple-minded solutions because they think technology can do anything. So they come up with the V-chip was 15 years ago, this great idea that we were just going to
25.
put it. Are we that old?
Yeah, over 20 years ago.
So again, it was great bumper sticker, totally impractical, and
yeah, you have some of that. I'd rather have a little bit of sort of that type 2 error than the type 1 error of not having enough technology.
Do we have other in the back?
Mark Bohannon with Red Hat. A comment and a caution. I just glanced at your report, Rob. I look forward to reading it more. My gut reaction is, because you and I are basically the same generation, things were so much simpler back then, right? I mean, I remember, you had the picture of the 5 people on the dais. So I remember there was one person I could call to get the view on tech policy, Evan Tisdale, all right? I mean, it didn't matter if anyone else was out there, okay? That's not the world anymore. And I think we got to be careful, because I don't remember quite the same way you do about the old world of the rational policy discussion. Maybe I missed it, but I think there's always been a dynamic there that let's not idealize 20, 30 years ago where a lot of this stuff was still going on. I think Bruce and several people hinted on the macro. I think it's more specific than that, which is I think it's about the way the communication channels have changed. Larry's an expert on this, but when I was doing policy in the 80s, my morning coffee was opening the fold of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and that would define my day. All right, what was on those headlines? That ain't the world anymore. And I think that the 2 cautions I have is, number one is, while I think the term techno-populism is loaded, it's also a reflection that technology is more pervasive in people's lives than it's ever been in the history of mankind. So it's not a completely irrational. I think there's a lot of sense of, this is something that's affecting me more than ever before, and that is affecting a lot of the way people see about things. Putting aside that there are legitimate criticisms about the way things are funded and how things get discussed. But the second caution I have is, and it's actually the word innovation there, because I think we need to be careful that we don't have a very sort of staid or antiquated notion of what innovation is anymore. And my views about what is innovative or not innovative have evolved from 30 years ago. And be careful that techno-populism doesn't become an overflow into the new models of innovation, which are very community-based. We see solutions being coming up in 30 minutes that used to take 3 months or 3 years. So be careful that you don't label everything as populism, because there is an element there that it's allowing us to actually solve problems in very different ways than it once did. So just a caution not to over-label everything that's going on, really as a result of the internet, but it's about more than the internet.
So just to quickly respond to that, Mark, when you read the paper, if you find that, let me know, because I don't believe there's any place in there where we questioned or put aspersions on the whole open innovation movement and the bottom-up innovation movement, things that we've been long supporters of. That's about how you would use the crowd and all these things to create innovation. In fact, we have an event coming up in a couple of weeks on the Hill on the role of small content creators, which is sort of in that vein, and want to celebrate that. So absolutely agree with you. On the first point, yeah, no, fundamentally it is different. You don't read 2 things in the morning, but that doesn't mean we can't expect or hold people in this debate to a relatively modest standard of discourse. Just because it's all on the internet, I mean, we get to act like idiots? We get to be abusive? I mean, I was on a panel recently with I'm sorry I don't remember her name, it was like 6-9 months ago, with a woman's rights leader on the internet, and talking about just the amazing amount of abuse that women get on the internet for articulating certain things. I mean, disgusting. Why aren't we calling that out more? Why is that? Why is this sort of the abuse you get on the internet if you take a stand? Why are we sort of saying, well, that's just the way the internet is? I think we need to have a collective societal norm that says, no, you can't do that. If I walked up to you,
Radical agree.
we wouldn't allow it. But you go, so you don't get to say that on the internet. Now, I'm not talking about a obnoxious chip mic here, you know, but you know, we do have norms with collective policies that we can, or you know, ideas. So I think that's really what I'm talking about.
Okay, fair enough.
I think we're getting close to running out of time here. Any final thoughts from the panel?
One thing where I would like the report to be a little different, aside from this major difference that I said at the beginning, is about digital copyright. Because I think there's an opportunity lost in not kind of at least making a gesture toward the reasons why sharing of information has worked really importantly in innovation, in the same way that the NIH policy, for instance, about making this their research available to people. There's a great experiment that went on in the Human Genome Project, and there were two participants, Celera and the Human Genome Project. And one was a model that we built innovation by holding close information that we discovered. And the other was a model that said we disclose everything we discover so that everybody can work on it. And there was a really wonderful study coming out of MIT which looked at the result of that and where more innovation came from. And the report said it's about a 30% increase in the commercialization of genetic tests that came out of the Human Genome Project because more people had a chance to look at that. More people had a chance to find different pathways toward innovation. And I think the maximalist copyright position has had a long run. We can see it in the retrospective extension of copyright. But there has not been the kind of recognition of the importance of sharing information, like spreading information available for innovation that we see in things like the Human Genome Project.
So, you know, Elliot, I think that, again, to me, part of the problem with the debate is that there are certainly, I think what the debate really in the space needs to be is where's the right balance between maximizing innovation and maximizing the rights of property owners? Largely not the debate we're having. The reason we supported the NIH publication open is because government paid for that. Okay, so I think sharing is good. You do not have the right to download my book, Innovation Economics: The Race for Global Advantage, without paying it. And I'm never going to give you that right. I'll give you a free copy though later, don't worry about it. But I'm never going to give you that right, because it's my property. I wrote it, and I get to decide who gets to use it, under what conditions. And I think that's what's missing in this debate. Right. If I choose that, hey, you know what, I'm going to put up 5 chapters, because I think, first of all, I want the knowledge out there, and I think I get more sales, I should get to be able to choose that.
And I don't dispute that whatsoever. But I would say that the notion that we make policy by retrospective extension of copyright for works that already exist, that we make policy that that doesn't address the issue of how to get access to orphan works for people to be able to make use of them. Those are the kinds of policies that don't go to the issue of you're having the right to control what you wrote.
I agree, but you know, and I would commend you, and I'm happy to send you this report we wrote 2 years ago called Economic Doctrines and Copyright, where we critique the maximalist position and argue it's not good for innovation, but we also critique the minimalist PK position. And I think that there needs to be a real debate about orphan works, for example. Yeah, there are real solutions on orphan works that would be very helpful. That's not really how we're having that debate, though.
Larry, let's try to wrap this.
Last 5 lines. I commend you on the report. What's important is we don't confuse techno-populism with techno-inclusion. What we really want to have is as inclusive debate as possible on all of these issues. And what we really need are for our politicians, our policymakers. And I know that Bruce is less sympathetic, but there was a time when these debates were nonpartisan, when they were as thoughtful as possible, when they were as inclusive as possible, and I think we'll get back to that. I think that nobody likes what's happened over the last few years over on any of these policies, and we've got, in terms of just the rancid nature of the debate, and we've got to find a way that we're talking facts as much as we can get them, and we're trying to get some kind of a balanced, moderate, middle of the road, nonpartisan discussion of one of the most important sectors of our economy.
Bruce, you're counting his lines. But do you have
I went to 8.
I took the over, but
any thoughts, Bruce?
Only, thanks for the report, thanks for the event, and for what it's worth, my suggestion, rather than trying to rewrite or you always think of the follow-on reports, the piece that I wrestle with is we in the tech community, a majority of your members, and certainly your sister organization's members, are probably the most adept at and the fastest to go use the tools of techno-populism when it serves our interests. And it's a hell of a weapon because, we're outgunned in the old broadcast your concerns via Washington folks in, but we crush the other side on networking. Networking beats broadcasting. And a challenge for us is we like techno-populism when the tools and the issues bend our way. And several of the ones in your report were the, tech industry. And other times we don't like it because we all intellectually agree that it could lead to dumbass policy outcomes. And so how to know when to use it ourselves and then when to wish the genie were back in the bottle, that's a tough one.
Like opposition to TPP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think that's it. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Took you over.
thank you.